Hello, Indie Houses Direct, and welcome to the Fireside Chat with Silverstring Media, the dev team and creators of the upcoming fellow traveler game, Glitchhikers, The Spaces Between, which will be published in 2022. We just premiered our trailer, and for those of you who missed it, we'd love to give you guys a peek and then get into the making of Glitchhikers, the thought process, and what you can expect from the game when it drops.
We all need a little time with our thoughts. Give folks some time, and you may find they're ready to share more of their story. Everyone likes to be seen and heard on their own terms. You're not alone out there. We're all traveling together tonight. Sometimes all we need is for someone to share their story or offer a different point of view.
This is Radio 90, and you're listening to Night Drive. Thanks for joining us tonight. Trace back through the turns and straightaways that led to a seemingly random encounter, and they begin to feel like dominoes lined up and ready for fate to fall into place.
And there were millions of such stories. Crucial moments on a path that led to you, here, now. You are the product of incredible survivorship.
Look at the night sky. What do you see out there? More than 7 billion people on this world. And all we have is each other. Our own little infinity.
I'm Sai, I use pronouns they, them, and I'm the communications manager for Silverstring. With me, I have our co-founders, Lucas and Claris, technical director, Phil, and musical lead, Devin. To start, how about each of you introduce yourselves and tell me a little bit about your past work in the games industry?
Thanks, Sai. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas J.W. Johnson. I use he, him pronouns. I am the co-founder, studio director of Silverstring, and the producer and writer for Glitchhikers, The Spaces Between, which we're super excited about. I've been working basically in the industry for almost a decade, often as a writer, and then starting Silverstring Media about 7-8 years ago with Claris, and doing lots of narrative consulting and game design and stuff on projects for the last little while. But we're super excited to be diving into a much bigger project in-house with Glitchhikers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claris Siren. I'm the co-founder and creative director at Silverstring Media. My pronouns are she, her. I came to games about 8 years ago when I started working with Lucas, and we started the company up. And before that, I was doing architectural work and graphic design. And I think to some extent, I still consider those backgrounds kind of my foundation. There's a lot of crossover in those skills, and they've always helped me. But a lot of the work I've done in the games industry has to do with narrative design, actually. And I think there are similarities between architecture and narrative design, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit more later. But some of the stuff we've done is narrative design consulting for a variety of independent games. That ranges from writing the scripts to games to just doing a little bit of tweaks and some consulting on a particular character.
Hi, everybody. My name's Phil Story. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm the technical director for Silverstring, a job I've been doing for about 1.5 years, although I have had a long history working on and off with Silverstring in various capacities outside of actually working for the studio. I also go by the moniker C-Melusine on Twitter and in some game dev spheres. Previous to my work with Silverstring, I worked at a number of Canadian mobile game companies that were funded by the sort of Canadian animation industry, working to create mobile games tied to Canadian animation properties, which is an interesting way to learn the ropes of game dev, certainly kind of a low stakes way. I also, as I sort of mentioned, work under the name C-Melusine as an independent developer, sometimes working on a couple of games that are available on HIO.
My name is Devin Vibert. I go by he, him pronouns, and I am the music lead for Glitchhikers, Spaces Between. I came to the video game industry by way of music first. I mean, I grew up playing a ton of video games, and it just never really occurred to me that I could combine two of my favorite things, music and video games, into like one career. So I came by it in second year of my studies for music production, realizing that this was actually a career path. And pretty much right at the gate, I just started writing music for games.
Okay, great. So today, during our conversation, I want to make sure to dive deep into what made the concept of Glitchhikers possible, the original mini game that was released in 2014, and just some background on what you all have to do. But as an icebreaker before we really kick things off, and for those listening who may be unfamiliar with Glitchhikers or your other work, I thought we could give them a sort of no spoilers, all vibes look at what to expect. So I'm going to ask you to describe a person that might like this game in the following format. I'll go first. If you can't make small talk with your aunts and uncles at a family barbecue, but you can spend hours telling a stranger everything you know about black holes, you might like our game. Lucas, what do you think?
If you ever fell down a Wikipedia rabbit hole and wound up wondering how one can retain hope in the face of humanity's failures and an uncaring universe, you might like our game.
Excellent. Claris?
Well, I guess I'll have to go with classic kind of inspiration for me. If you've ever not been able to sleep as a teenager in East Texas and need to drive alone late at night, maybe to a local fast food restaurant for some early morning taquitos, then this game might be for you.
Great. Devin?
If you are the type of person who walks into a big empty room and the first thing you do is clap and say, "Echo!" then this game might be for you.
What about you, Phil?
If you follow the Twitter bot Liminal Spaces, then this game is definitely for you.
So Glitchhikers, The Spaces Between is not your first time delving into this world. As I've already mentioned, there was an experimental alt game known now as Glitchhikers First Drive from 2014. Old fans of the game might be curious about where this new game is going to fit in relation, or the differences in scope. Is First Drive a demo? Is The Spaces Between a sequel? Where does it fit?
I mean, we made the original Glitchhikers, which we're, as you say, we're now calling Glitchhikers First Drive, back in 2014. It was sort of the first quote-unquote big project that Silverstring did sort of on our own in-house, which all four of us worked on. It was a complete experience of its own at the time. It was intended to be this, relatively short, 20 to 30 minute experience. And that's what we wanted from it at the time. But we always knew that there was more that we wanted to explore with the idea. And especially when we saw the sort of relative success of that project, a lot of people seemed to really connect to it. We knew we had hit on something that we could do more with. We're looking at it as sort of a rebirth and reimagining of sort of the Glitchhikers idea. First Drive isn't so much a demo as, it is what it is, what it was when we made it, and it stands on its own. But this is taking that concept and turning it into something much bigger. Lots more content, lots more opportunities. Many more hours of gameplay if that's your yardstick. But something that we're able to take this thing that we loved so dearly and turn it into something just so much more than we ever could have hoped for.
I think for me, I wasn't as surprised by the success of the First Drive as I think the rest of the team, partially because I did have a strong sense of how universal the forces we were toying with were, and how common the experience that we were simulating was. But the things that really surprised me were how quickly people were ready to pick up on the space making and architectural implications of a game like Glitchhikers, the divinatory and magical and spiritual qualities of a game like Glitchhikers, and the desire for those kinds of spaces and functions to be incorporated in games, I started to get a sense of the hunger for that kind of content being there as we released Glitchhikers. And we've all had 7 years to think about this stuff, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. It's been something I continually look back to and ask myself, why did this work so well? And I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to apply so many of those thoughts and lessons into the development of Spaces Between.
For the uninitiated, the experience of Glitchhikers' first drive is that you're driving down an abandoned highway late at night, and you're picking up hitchhikers for a series of strange and surreal conversations. How did this concept come about? Was this how you all met? And when did you decide that this was something you wanted to do together?
I believe we all met at a game jam called I Am a Gamer, specifically for the purpose of making small video games with female protagonists. But shortly thereafter, Lucas and I had lunch with Phil and talked about maybe collaborating at some point. I think Lucas and I were very impressed with Phil's Game Jam game. And from there, one thing led to another. And before too long, Phil reached out to us with an idea for a game about driving late at night.
Yeah, I remember going to that meeting with like 2 different ideas because that's always, never just present one idea. You gotta have 2 or 3 or 4. But in this case, I had 2, and the other one was a way bigger, way more complicated game that I probably was more excited about, but also was not feasible at all for us to do. Like it was a terrible idea to be bringing to like a first time kind of like, let's collab, do something small. And I think the 2 of you rightly saw through that and said, well, maybe we try the smaller one, the nighttime driving one. That sounds a little bit more doable. I think I pitched that game as we could do it inside of like 2 or 3 months, and it ended up taking probably 6, maybe a little more.
Yeah, I remember as we got into the development of Glitchhikers, what I loved about it was, Phil brought us this great concept, and we were all able to riff on it so easily. We all ended up bringing something really personal to it. I mean, I remember where I was when I was writing a lot of the conversations in the original game, and the cool ideas that we were exploring and stuff like that. And so it became something that was very personal to all of us, which I think, was really great and, helped make it what it is. And then Claris, as Claris said, Phil, Claris, and I all met at a game jam, sort of in the local Vancouver industry. And then I've known Devin since grade 3. So when we were talking about this project, I knew the amazing musical work that Devin could do. So I was like, well, we need to pull him into this. And Devin, maybe you can talk about the music of the original a bit. But I remember thinking the kind of thing that we're looking for is unlike anything I think Devin has ever composed, because we were going for this really weird sort of surreal aesthetic, even in the music. But I thought, this is very different for him, but I bet he can do it. And my God, did he hit it out of the park?
Well, except that I convinced myself that I had failed at one point during the first drive. I was when I first started writing the music for it. I mean, I was only a few years out of school, and I had a very strong sense that I had no idea what I was doing. When I started writing the music, nothing was working for me at all. Nothing at all. Every time I wrote it, I would go back to some of the songs that we had used as references, and it never sounded at all like those. And in my frustration one night, I just kind of started chopping up audio and like throwing it everywhere and just like crushing it beyond recognition. And then some of the songs were born out of that. It was this kind of like, once I'd given up trying to write the songs, they just started working for me. I don't know. It was weird.
I love that. I remember one in particular. You sent over a couple of the early songs, and I think it was one of the ones that we were considering for like the end credits music or something. And I remember standing with Claris and listening to it and going like, this is really good, but it's not quite the right vibe. And I was about to like send you a message, and you were messaging me saying, you know what? No, this was not good. This is not quite the right vibe. What about this? And you know, provided an alt version of it. And Claris and I were like, yes, that's the one.
It's definitely very interesting, Devin, hearing you describe where you were at in that moment as like you were failing to do this music, especially when you look at the critical response that sort of took everyone on the team a little bit by surprise. It was not something that was expected to come from this game. And what almost everyone talks about is how much the music adds to that experience, especially because of the pacing of the game. Do you think that this process has widened your horizon in terms of what you think you're capable of creating different kinds of music? Because like it was definitely a departure from, say, the Azrael Stop soundtrack that you did, or even something like Flow Weaver, which is closer into that lane.
Absolutely. I should mention, every time I start a new project, there is always a 1 to 3 month period where you just feel that you're way in over your head and you have no idea what's going on, and you're horrible and everything you've ever done is garbage. So in the middle of that, in the first Glitchhikers, Phil sent me a song. I mean, obviously I listened to Pinky's Dream a fair few times during development, but he introduced me to this song called Alone at the Danube River by Dirty Beaches. And it's just this very sparse, very lonely piece. And I listened to it and I was like, this is amazing. There's almost nothing in this song, but it's just really, really, really good. And also, how the hell am I going to do this? Like, hearing this song, I realized, or it came to be that I had to force myself. I had to force myself to learn all of these new ways of recording, and but this isn't the right way I record it. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. Does it get me the sound that I want? Okay, great. I have to credit the original Glitchhikers as well as the Spaces Between for broadly expanding my musical palette. I've been delving into genres that honestly 8 months ago I did not know they existed.
So the game is pretty non-traditional, and with how pared back the mechanics are, with what the vibe is that you were going for, and especially compared to a lot of other games that people might refer to or think of first when you think about a driving simulator. It's definitely not the fantasy that a racing game is, or that GTA is, for example, and yet people are really able to get lost in it and relate it to the experience of driving in a completely different sense. What do you think the pared down mechanics do for that experience?
I mean, to my mind, the mechanics of Glitchhikers, they're different than a lot of other games in which the mechanics, like the sort of physical interaction with the keyboard, is the point of the game, where you're learning, how to interact inside these systems and how to master them. Where Glitchhikers, what we're trying to do is use the mechanics to set a tone and a mood and sort of draw you in a little bit. I mean, the digital medium being one that is interactive and does require you to, kind of have a continuous interaction with these physical devices. It's a way to sort of guide your brain into the kind of channels that we're looking for. I mean, locked onto the road, moving forward, always forward. So it's really, I think, about setting the scene.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we designed Glitchhikers First Drive to be, every element was about creating the space of you driving alone on a highway late at night, to sort of create this environment in which you have, strange introspective thoughts like you do when it's late at night and your mind is wandering, and then sort of interrogating those with the characters that appear. And part of that is, when you're driving, if you've ever had that experience of driving on a highway late at night, it becomes sort of an automatic thing. You stop thinking about the mechanics of driving a car. You just kind of do it. And so that was part of how we wanted to design the mechanics of Glitchhikers, where you had some control over the car. You could change lanes, you can speed up a little, you can slow down a little, you can look around, but you can't drive off the side of the road because that's not something you do in real life typically. And so we also wanted to take that and expand that concept into the spaces between with the new journeys that we're introducing. Each one we look at the mechanics and say, how can we represent best what this experience is really like by paring that down and having it just be sort of the core of that experience, so that you don't have to think about oh shoot, I have to hit that button at the right time or whatever, because that's not what these sort of chill, tired experiences in real life are like.
So I know a lot of the ways that we talk about this game makes it sound very philosophical. Like, obviously there's a lot of thought that goes into the elements that we've put together here. And, it often comes out like a string of $10 words. But I find that what strikes me about the experience here is really just like how accessible and very warm it is for most people who actually sit down and play the game and go through the experience of driving this car down a highway and picking up random characters, some of whom are a little surreal, some of whom are a little out of this world, but yet who drag you into these very familiar conversations that you've probably had with a friend at a sleepover, or that you think privately to yourself late at night when you don't have something distracting you. So what's the elevator pitch for people to really understand what that experience is like outside of the constructs that go into making that experience?
Sai, you sort of, the elevator pitch of what is the experience like? I mean, you mentioned the conversations you have at a sleepover. And I think that's so true to the kinds of content that we're exploring and the way that we're exploring it, right? I mean, a sleepover is itself sort of a liminal space, that strange in between where you're up way later than you're supposed to be, and having these conversations with friends about, life in the universe and the future and the past. And did you hear about that weird thing on, that they discovered recently, or that weird animal that I just learned about in a YouTube video, or that kind of thing. And that's really how we have traditionally shaped the kinds of content that you experience in Glitchhikers, the spaces between, in these conversations with these weird surreal characters that you meet. And it's that sort of, it's an element of sort of like pop science, pop psychology, of looking at big existential questions, but able to frame it in a way that is more accessible, not because we're, we need to make it more accessible for people or whatever because they're such big, philosophical topics, but more accessible just in the way that people talk about them. Like, everyone has these conversations, and you can have them as a high-end academic in a 30-page paper with words that I don't understand, or you can just have them with your friend late at night, and that's sort of where we lean a lot of those conversations. And hopefully we're also we're introducing interesting concepts or ideas. Like, maybe you haven't heard of that weird animal yet, but we're going to tell you about that weird animal because it's a cool metaphor for the life that we're living in COVID times or whatever. So that's a big part of how we sort of have approached a lot of these conversations.
I certainly understand what you mean about the $10 words, and some words that we started to use and lean on, like liminal and liminal spaces, when we were first making the first drive, are now much more popular thanks to things like the liminal spaces Twitter bot. And, there was a time when I thought that was an incredibly inaccessible concept that we had to kind of approach by putting it in the context of, something as familiar as a late night drive. But these kinds of concepts, despite the fact that they're seen as the domain of academics and academia, these concepts belong to everyone who has looked up at the night sky and wondered what's out there or what it all means. I think that there is we are entering a real era of spiritual searching, and perhaps even an era of like spiritual crisis of faith and conscience. There are dark things on the horizons, and the usual cultural touchstones that we rely on to give us guidance and clarity might not be doing it for a variety of reasons. Again, like, we're trying to make sure that this game, no matter what your education level is, no matter what your experiences are, it's always fundamentally coming back to, first and foremost, these very familiar universal concepts.
Just to add to that, I think a lesson that we've all learned about, game making, and I think this applies to a lot of other creative mediums, filmmaking, etc., is that, like, when you want to do challenging stuff, when you want to talk about challenging concepts, it's important to allow people sort of an easy entry into them. Like, they have to be sort of grounded in something familiar before you can throw them a heavy curveball. And so I think Glitchhikers is very much an attempt to do that a lot of the time. Again, going back to the mechanics, it's like we're trying to put you in a familiar place before you sort of are challenged by some of these more complicated ideas.
We've talked a little bit about some of the real life influences and experiences that went into the concept of this game. At the same time that it was being developed, there were a lot of other things in media that have very similar thematic elements and symbology. A lot of people point to the podcast Welcome to Night Vale, which was growing in popularity at the time. Other games like Kentucky Route Zero. What do you think was happening in the zeitgeist that parallel processes would have created so many surreal and strange stories like this that are so introspective and existential? What were you listening to? What were you watching that helped form this slice of a world?
This is definitely a project that, everyone brought something to. Everyone had their own kind of journeys, experiences with late night radio, weird music, strange existential thoughts, road trips, their own experiences with kind of starting to do the work. I think when Phil originally brought up the idea of making a driving game, it was specifically drawing on his experiences driving back and forth from Alberta to BC. I think there were a lot of different strains of kind of cultural change and cultural ideas rising and kind of joining the zeitgeist, as you were saying. Like, there were other projects that were happening similarly at the same time that we really hadn't checked out very closely, like Kentucky Route Zero, though we are all big fans of the game now. And I think that there was a rising sense of surrealism in games and in media in general that was partly born out of just the increasing hyperreality due to things like mass media and 24-hour news cycle, the internet, social media, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, I have a lot of experience driving late at night as a teen, dealing with insomnia. But during my time driving around late at night, I listened to a bunch of NPR down in the States and heard a bunch of wild, weird late night radio, the kind of stuff that inspired things like Night Vale. And one particular example was the disintegration loops, which are these kind of eaten away, warbly tapes that were part of a sound installation that was shelved after 9/11 because the creator was traumatized by the events that had happened and came back to that work years later and improperly stored it, and the tapes were just destroyed and mangled and made music out of that. And that was one of the kind of exemplars that we were pointing to early on in the process. But I think that it was really cool how Devin found his own way to that kind of mangled, destructive, like pulling it out of the crucible of like a fraught creative process. And I think that there was something quite magical that was captured in that process.
We made the original Glitchhikers game in the middle of what has, or was known at the time and sort of continues to be known as the alt games period. Sort of a small movement in games on the heels of some other small movements in games to, try and branch out, try and do kind of different stuff. There were, at the time, a lot of really interesting creators making games and uploading them to itch.io and other sort of smaller web platforms. The kind of stuff that couldn't get on Steam. Partially because they were all made with literally zero funding, and partially just because, it was a lot of devs who I think were, just starting their careers, sort of trying to figure out how to express things in video games in a different manner, in a way that fit with, kind of some of the zeitgeist stuff that Claris was talking about. So, people like Kitty Horror Show, Natalie Lawhead, a number of really interesting creators at the time making stuff. And Glitchhikers definitely came out of that, kind of thinking as well. I think we were all sort of playing some of those games at the time. I feel like there was a sort of a movement of like walking sims, but also just generally like sort of 3D experiential games that Glitchhikers sort of fits into the mold of. I always do think of the original Glitchhikers as a walking sim, even though you obviously don't do any walking. And I think a lot of people felt similarly about it. So, the alt games movement is sort of over now. It has come and gone to be replaced by new energy, new kind of folks making stuff. But it was a really special time for me personally. I made a lot of great friends during that time. These developers, we're all on Twitter discussing a lot of this stuff. So it was really neat.
I don't know what else I was specifically consuming at the time that led to, how I approached Glitchhikers, other than just sort of a voracious interest in a lot of different topics. I'm a big champion of sort of a liberal arts approach to knowledge, like little bits and pieces here and there. And, there's lots of things that ended up in conversations in Glitchhikers First Drive and in the spaces between that come from like, hey, that was a cool fact that I learned in my classical studies course back in university that I've always loved. It's, one of those like, hey, did you know this cool thing?
Claris, you've sort of described the game in the past as sort of doing tarot or having a meditation experience. Do you want to get a little bit into that and what that means to you?
Sure. I would love to actually talk about what it means to me. In the past, I've spoken about tarot divination as it connects to narrative design and game design from a more kind of detached standpoint, just talking about the mechanics and trying to regard these spiritual tools as if they are just games and game mechanics. When I started working on Glitchhikers, the First Drive, I very much thought that magical thinking was dangerous and should not be trifled with. In the intervening years between Glitchhikers, the First Drive, and now working on Spaces Between, I've had the chance to really study things like tarot and other forms of magic, chaos magic, and learn from them, as well as understand a little bit more about some of their underlying principles. And I think there's a lot of similarity insofar as all that's really being done is a productive form of brain hacking. It can be as symbolic as you want it to be, or it can be as simple as just seeing what sort of story emerges and letting it mean nothing. Through that process of finding meaning and then deciding whether at the end to disregard it or to take it on board, and the ways that it might linger in our mind despite our decision at the end of the play session. It's in those ways that things like tarot are effective. And it's my hope that games like Glitchhikers will be able to serve similar functions, not only as games and pieces of entertainment, but also potentially as spiritual tools. And so I think this transference of spiritual significance onto mundane objects is also part of the zeitgeist. You see that happening in things like Kentucky Route Zero and Welcome to Night Vale. It's part of that surrealism. But it's also, I think, part of this response to people having a more personalized spirituality, a more personalized relationship with ritual, people starting to look at magic and magical thinking with a different lens. It's not just self-delusion, and it's not just, one size fits all horoscopes.
Moving forward a little bit, obviously this has been a long time coming. None of you really ever felt like you could fully put this game down and felt drawn to build out this world to include all of these other diverse journeys. What thought process was put into selecting the new kinds of journeys that you can take in Glitchhikers, the Spaces Between? Were there any that didn't make the cut? what defined that kind of journey or liminal space for you guys?
The original game was this 20 to 30 minute thing that a lot of people really strongly connected with, and we didn't want to lose that concept. And I think there's certainly a problem with a lot of game development of sort of this idea of, well, we have to make it longer, we have to create more and more content for the value to proposition to be there or whatever, which I fundamentally reject. And so there was this balance of reimagining this game and creating so much more content without feeling like we were, creating bloat on something that was sort of already good as it was, or something like that. We wanted to expand the universality of the Glitchhikers experience, making something that was sort of this universal thing that anyone could approach and recognize what we were doing and feel comfortable in this space was a big part of Glitchhikers. Our whenever we would talk to people about what the game was, my pitch was always, hey, so that experience of where you're like driving on a highway late at night and like you're just listening to music and your mind is wandering, and most people I would talk to would say like, yeah, and I'd say, well, that's what the game is. And they'd be like, oh, cool. And that worked like 80% of the time. And then the other 20%, you'd get somebody responding with, well, I don't drive. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't know, just imagine it then. Like where do you go from there to explain this universal experience, with heavy quotes? And so one of the first ones that we all, even I remember when we released Glitchhikers First Drive, we were already talking about like, well, the highway drive is such a ubiquitous experience for people in North America, which is a very car-centric culture, I would suggest, but maybe less so for people in Europe, which is a much more train-centric culture. And so it's like, well, what if we did like a train version or something? What would that look like? And so I think that was the first. Glitchhikers: The Spaces Between has a train journey as one of its journeys, and I think that was sort of the first big one that we were like, well, if we're going to do this, we're at least going to do that. And then we sort of took the opportunity to think, what other sort of universal experiences are there? Another of the big ones that we're looking at is a walk in the park. You put on your headphones, you go for a walk late at night when you can't sleep, and that kind of thing. And I think that's also sort of has this element of universality. Maybe not for everyone, but there's hopefully something for everyone in the spaces between.
One of the things that I was really surprised by with the original game's reception, with the First Drive's reception, is how much people picked up on what I felt were very subtle ideas that influenced me, but I didn't really feel like I had communicated them very strongly at all through the game. Notions that like games create spaces. They are forms of architecture. Spaces can have transformative impacts on people. They are also stages for people to perform actions. What if we are creating a stage that is meant to get people to perform the action of a solitary ritual where they ask themselves questions about life, the universe, and everything? Okay, well, I guess the architecture of that is a car. That was a strange conclusion for me, though it sort of clicked for a variety of other reasons. And I felt like, okay, this is a really cool thing. I hope I get to push this further. But in seeing how people wrote about the game, talked about the game after it released, I was so pleased to see how much people just blatantly picked up on those implications. And those implications have always been things that we wanted to push forward. So beyond just this idea of, okay, make a more universal experience, also let's flex a little bit now that we are stepping outside of just the train and the car. Can we not just make a park, but maybe a sculpture park? Let's play with landscape architecture and the way that the built form and the environment intermingle. But also, because this is Glitchhikers, let's acknowledge the fact that there actually isn't any real distinction between the natural landscape and the built architecture in a digital space. But they're both made of the same stuff by the same tools, right? So playing with these notions and really digging into these things, and I feel like expressing these ideas through the architectural text for the first time is super exciting for me, And I'm just so thrilled that I know there are folks out there who are already excited and already going to pick up what we're putting down. And so that's definitely something that we were excited to explore. There's one other mode that's very architectural, but I'm not going to mention it any further right now.
And Devin, we've already kind of talked a little bit about the different musical scapes that make each journey on this game unique. What did you have to use in your process to make sure that each of them really felt distinct and like they were conveying the mood that each of those journeys was calling for, but it still kind of all feels like it has the spirit of a Glitchhikers song?
That's a good question. Kind of the core tenet of the Glitchhikers music, from my perspective at least, is be evocative, but like stay out of the way. And so a lot of my focus is, okay, well, how is the music going to best like complement the experience that we want them to have? And there's a time when the music can stick out, but knowing when is not that time is like 3/4 of the battle, I think. So with each journey, just it's a question of, okay, well, how can I take this core tenet and apply it in kind of a unique way that best, captures the experience you're trying to have in this different journey. So whether that's, maybe leaning more towards the feelings of comfort, if that lends itself to a journey, or, even including lyrics. A lot of the songs in the first Glitchhikers had lyrics, but they were, obtuse. It's hard to tell what was being said, and that was intentional. Playing with where lyrics sit in the mix can affect whether a person's paying attention to the music or whether they're paying attention to something else. People tend to, not always, but they often focus on the lyrics because they're used to hearing people talk and sing. And so just being very aware of what some of those decisions are going to do to the experience the player has as I'm trying to write them as standalone tracks is a challenge, but it's what I'm here for, I think. So yeah, that was the biggest thing for me, is making sure that I'm always at least staying out of the way of the person's experience, complimenting, not being like, hey, look at me.
Phil, I think that something Devin just said also kind of ties into things that I've heard you talk about when it comes to thinking about how this new game is going to use UI to create a more seamless experience, being evocative, but staying out of the way. What do you think you had to do to bring that into other journeys where the control types are not the same as the drive, and the need for freer movement comes into play for things like the walk in the park?
Yeah, so we spent quite a while kind of contemplating, we had this concept from the beginning of development that every journey has a different control scheme. Like the mechanics of interacting with the space is all slightly different, or not even slightly, fairly different from sort of journey to journey. And obviously that presents a pretty big challenge in terms of like, how do we get the player to understand that, well, 1 minute they're in the drive, pressing Q and E to turn their head, and the next they're going to be using the mouse or holding W to move forward instead of sort of freely moving forward. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, do we need to tutorialize this? Like, are we gonna run between every journey a little startup? I mean, the original game had that, at the very beginning, no matter how many playthroughs you do, it still has this little like startup sequence where it shows you the controls and sort of lets you play around a little bit before going on. And it's very short, but one thing I think I personally didn't like is that it happened every time you played. If you've played 4 or 5 times, it's pretty annoying to just have to sit through this whole little startup sequence. And, with switching the context of the interaction between every like scene load, basically, we didn't think we could necessarily get rid of the concept of like reorienting people into like, okay, reminding them, what are you actually doing here? So, we spent a lot of time working on this sort of like UI concept of basically always showing the controls to you, but in a somewhat lighter manner, and that's how we sort of arrived at this like letterboxed UI with like the main controls and sort of some contextual stuff coming up at all times.
I'll just add to that one of the hopes that we had for that sort of constant tutorialization in a way, always showing you what the controls are and what all of the controls are, because there's only a few in each journey ultimately, was also to help make the game as accessible as possible. Not just, we have a lot of ways that the game can become accessible to people with different needs, but also for people who don't play games. Because we wanted to create this really sort of universal experience, and we're not asking people to do, highly skilled game-related interactions and stuff like that. We wanted anyone who was interested in the concept, who maybe never played a game before, to be able to come into this experience and be able to figure out what they needed to do to move forward. And for so many people, like, pressing W to move forward is not at all intuitive, right? Why is that a thing? Why wouldn't it be the arrow keys or whatever? And so by having these control schemes sort of always present in a way that's out of the way, but there if you sort of need it, we wanted to really make sure that anyone could come in and figure out what that looked like.
Yeah, it's really interesting, all of the ways that this game has been designed to really be an experience for everybody, from how simple the controls are, to removing a lot of the skill barriers that exist in other games. We've described this game as a freeform narrative experience. Something that I've always found striking is that this game has no defined main character for a player to slip into. There's no conceit, there's no costume. It's really just themselves having these conversations and exploring these spaces. How is writing that different from a more traditional game narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing with Glitchhikers, is there's no plot line either, right? Like, you think about a narrative game and you imagine a story that you're going to play through. And that's not what we're doing. We're more about, like I've said, so many times, creating that space for players to have an experience, and to bring themselves to it. And everyone is going to bring something different to it. And we've made design decisions like, you don't see hands on the steering wheel in the driving the car, because we don't want to dictate what your hands look like. There's never any embodiment for the player in the game, so that it is, entirely themselves, if that's how they want to approach it. I mean, I remember, watching Let's Plays of Glitchhikers First Drive years ago, where, some people talk about it as a character. Oh, well, this character has these options available to them, and so I'm going to role play this character in this particular way, versus responding to questions just as yourself. And I think that's entirely valid as well. But ultimately, we want to, in these conversations, allow for different perspectives. A lot of the times when you have the opportunity to respond to one of the characters, we try to have a range of ways that you could respond to them. And we're never going to be perfect at that. We have, limited options, and there are certainly, some players are going to want to say things that aren't available to them in the game, but hopefully there's something that they can grab onto to have that experience be personal to them and feel like they're having this conversation.
I think it might be fair to say that, the last 2 years, there's been a lot of shared experience. And I think that most people have spent more time with themselves or being introspective than perhaps at any other period in their lives, just because of the great amounts of, isolation. Do you think that this is going to add to people's experience, or are they going to be interacting with this game in a different way than they would have in 2014 when First Drive came out?
I think that there's no way that people won't regard a game about the liminality of travel and contemporary travel spaces. There's no way that they're not going to come into this with some sort of lens or filter that's informed by the pandemic. I think that there's an opportunity, given that this game is all about holding space for people to process, to heal if that's what they need, or just to let their mind wander, just to be. But I also think that as much as we were informed so much by the pandemic and our experiences during it, and we know that people will be bringing their own experiences with it, we also hope that the ways that the pandemic, COVID, quarantine global catastrophes are referenced in the game are oblique enough to be evergreen and to be capable of taking on that meaning or having you dismiss that meaning. So this is not going to be a game about COVID or traveling during a pandemic or anything like that. And we are very keen to make sure that this game doesn't just get bogged down by those connotations, although it tries to be aware of everything that a player might be bringing to the experience.
Yeah, going back to what I was talking about, the core tenet being that I want it to be interesting, but I don't want to get in the way of people's experience. That's actually been doubly challenging working on this game through everything that's happened in the last 2 years. It's really tempting, especially as when I write songs, I tend to pour a bit of myself into that work, no matter how many times I listen to reference works, no matter how many times whatever I'm doing, inevitably how I feel in that given moment is going to, to some degree, pour into the music. And so it's been a challenge to restrain myself from trying to pour too much of what my experience has been in the last 2 years into my music, when my experience has probably been vastly different from other people's. And so trying to keep an open mind and remember that, as I write this song, it's not just my perspective that I'm trying to be representative of. And I have to be careful that I don't make assumptions about what the player is or isn't going to feel in a given moment.
Yeah, it's been interesting, certainly as writing a lot of the conversations for the spaces between, a lot of them definitely are influenced by the state of the world since starting the project. The whole game, all of the conversations to some extent are about examining our place in the universe and how we deal with existential crises, how we feel about life and death, all of these kinds of things. This idea of the cosmic sublime, and all of those have definitely been influenced by the pandemic and other events in the world right now. And those definitely come into the conversations that you have in the game. There are some that are somewhat explicitly about those things, some that are maybe more subtly about those things. But it's all about setting the stage to let the player have their own experience with that thing, right? It's about asking those questions, not about dictating an answer.
When you're dealing with a lot of very introspective or existential topics, it's easy for the tone to get very dark or very heavy for the people in that experience. And yet, as somebody who's been playing this game a lot and is a very big fan, I find that the game always has a way of keeping the balance in those things so that you have the sort of space and safety to look at the hard topics, but it's also not just trying to bog you down with all of the world's problems. It does have a lot of lightness and a lot of curiosity and happiness, and it looks at the wonder of the universe as much as it looks at the mystery of the universe. How did you guys go about sort of intentionally keeping that balance and not just sort of letting the experience spiral into the problems of the world?
It was always something that was very important to us from the beginning, from the original Glitchhikers First Drive. One of the touchstones that we always go back to is the idea of the cosmic sublime, being able to look out into the void, into the vastness of the universe and our relative tininess, and look at that with a sense of awe and wonder rather than, hopelessness. And as a company, Silverstring, it's really important to me that the stories that we tell in general are stories ultimately of hope. We wanted to explore some darker topics. There are characters you can talk to that have very sort of nihilistic outlooks, or talking about heavy topics like death and grief. But we always wanted to make sure that we gave the player the opportunity to push back against that at the very least, to say, no character who is being very nihilistic right now, there is, love and hope in the universe. And that's something that I'm really excited about with Glitchhikers, the Spaces Between, especially because we have, more characters than we had in First Drive, but also you can encounter those characters in multiple journeys. They are recurring across multiple journeys, but they have different conversations each time that you meet them in a different context. And that means we had an opportunity that we didn't have in First Drive to give some of them more of a character arc in a way for us to introduce a topic in one conversation and then push it further or push it in a different direction in another conversation, and maybe help those characters come to a more hopeful place, along with sort of encouraging that in the player as well.
So then just a wrap-up question for everyone. What stands out for each of you as an aspect of this experience that you've designed that you really hope comes across clearly to players? Like, what do they need to come back and say about Glitchhikers, the spaces between, so that you've nailed what you set out to do?
That's a very good question. And I have to say, Sai, it caught me off guard a little bit, because I've been thinking so much about how much it took me aback that people saw what I was bringing to the First Drive from an architectural perspective. People picked up on that, and that made me feel super successful in a way that I didn't anticipate. I suppose that the thing that would make me feel like I succeeded the most is just hearing that this is a game that people not only come back to after 6 months, a year, but also they have in their back pocket, so to speak. They know that the next time they are struggling to fall asleep or feeling a little off or suffering from an existential crisis, that they know that they have this space that they can go to and that it will be there for them and ready for them. Hearing that from players would, I think, mean a lot. But honestly, the thing I'm most excited about is just seeing what people make of this space, no matter what. There are no wrong answers. There were no wrong answers in the First Drive, and there are no wrong answers in the spaces between.
For me, I think pretty much along the lines that Claris laid out, I would really love it if we had people coming into the game, months after its release, years after its release, like we did with the original, talking to us about like taking a stroll or going for a ride, riding the rails for just 20 minutes every 6 months. That was like so impactful to me for something that happened to us for the first game. So kind of continuing that tradition would be good. My other thing is that I hope people find out the meaning of the blue rose.
One of the things that really stuck out for me in the original Drive is this one conversation you can have, and I won't go into too much detail, but it touches on this term from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, if you're familiar with that. This term, I love this word, called sonder. And it's basically this concept of, every single person that you walk by on the street has their own unique story and perspective, and it could be completely different from what you've experienced. So yeah, I would hope that's what people would take away is that at least something in the game would open their eyes to something they'd never considered before, whether that's, a musical genre, a philosophical concept, or just a different way of looking at a common problem that everyone has.
What I love about this game is someone who doesn't have a background in video game design and who's coming at things from the position of a blank slate, is this feeling that there are people out there in the world that are all having these same kinds of thoughts that I've had at different points in my life. And then people who have completely different life experiences to see private thoughts and weird experiences that I have reflected back, I think is a very powerful experience. So I think that that's also the way that people develop empathy. So what I would like to see people take from this game is that sense that, they're not alone in the universe, and they're not the only person out there having these kinds of thoughts. And to know that, there's a story and a humanity to everyone that they're going to encounter. And if you take the time to stray away from topics like the weather and everyone's health, you might actually find that there are people out there who both have the same experiences to you and have completely different perspectives to you, to help you reapproach what those things mean.
On that note, for me, something that I hope players find certainly is there's lots of little, there's little Easter eggs and references and meta conversations and things that we've put into the game in various places. Connections between the music and the VO and the writing and the art and all of that kind of stuff that I always would love players and to be able to pick up on and things like that, because otherwise I'm not doing my job well. But ultimately, I think my real answer is anything. If players get anything out of this game, anything at all, then ultimately I think we've succeeded. I mean, it goes back to what Claris said. There's no wrong answers, and any experience is a valid experience with Glitchhikers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what those experiences are.